very, very honored to have Glenna Barlow from the Columbia Museum of Art in Columbia, South Carolina, to talk to us about Thomas Day. A beautiful piece from our Spotlight exhibitions that is upstairs, a piece of furniture. I'm not going to say anything more because she's going to figure that. Glenna is the Curator of Education at the museum and has been there for over 9 years. She has a Master's of Fine Art from VCU. Yay! I'm from Virginia, so Virginia Commonwealth University in Richmond. She has curated numerous diverse exhibitions, including Tang Dynasty ceramics, of which, of course, upstairs we have our beautiful Tang horse, Islamic art, as well as Auguste Rodin. So she's done some really interesting stuff. So anyway, just please welcome Glenna Barlow for the evening. And my last little tidbit is if you have a cell phone, please turn it to vibrate or off. And if you need a restroom, it's just right across the hall over there. So welcome. Have a good night.
Great. Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate all of you for supporting the museum and the work that museums do in general, so thank you to all of you. And very appreciative of the Mobile Museum of Art for inviting me to be here so they can stand and facilitated that. And of course our bridges. We always like to acknowledge them. Without them, none of this would be possible. So I'm particularly delighted to be here to have an opportunity to talk to you about the work and life of a really remarkable artist. It is really no exaggeration to say that Thomas Day was perhaps one of the most sought after cabinet makers in North Carolina in the decades leading up to the Civil War. His work adorned buildings of universities, governor's mansions, and the homes of countless well-to-do families in the region. He was a gifted craftsman, he was an innovative artist, and he was a shrewd businessman, as we'll see. But what makes his story really remarkable is his station in life, as he achieved all of this success as a free black business owner in the antebellum South. So what then makes this figure so extraordinary? How was he able to achieve this relative success in a time of rampant suspicion, fear, and hostility towards people of color and in the environment that was the South prior to the Civil War? Right? Day's success really is due in no small part to his intelligence and his artistic abilities, but it had a lot to do also with his shrewdness and with his resilience. These were the abilities that really allowed him to leverage what privileges he did have and that he was afforded within the circumstances that he was forced to navigate. So we know that there were other free men of color residing in North Carolina around the same time as Thomas Day, and even that some of them were also in the business of making furniture. There surely were other stories that were similar to Day's, and I'm sure many of these have been lost to time. But fortunately for us, Thomas Day left us a substantial body of work and a few documents and historical records that have helped scholars to start uncovering his really intriguing story. So we'll hear more of that tonight. Right. So what do we know about this figure? Well, Thomas Day was born in Dinwiddie County, Virginia in 1801. He was the son of John Day and Morning Stewart. His father was born to a wealthy South Carolina white woman. His mother's parents were both free people of color, and her father had been a doctor. So according to law, since his mother was free, Day inherited her free status. And because of his heritage and how social constructs of race were understood at that time, Day was often referred to as mulatto. So when you hear that term, that's a historical term that was used to indicate his ethnicity. There are no daguerreotypes or any other kinds of likenesses of Day that exist today. This sculpture imagines what he might have looked like based on a photograph of his brother. So it may not be a very good likeness, but that was the best information that they could base this on. What we do know is that his light skin and his designation as mulatto would have afforded him some degree of acceptance among his white contemporaries. But there is no evidence that Day ever passed for white, so there's really no conjecture that would suggest that that was the case. So Day's story really in some ways is reflective of national and local attitudes towards race, and we'll see that, how those kind of shift and change over the course of his lifetime. So though Day was born in Virginia, in 1817, the elder Day, his father, moved the family to neighboring North Carolina, which at the time had less restrictive policies towards the activities of free black people. Thomas Day would eventually settle in Milton, North Carolina, which is just over the border. If you look at a map, it's just like barely in North Carolina. It's really close to Virginia. It's in Caswell County. It had rich soil that was really conducive to growing lots of crops like tobacco, corn, wheat. It boasted both small and large farms because of that rich soil. And the nearby Dan River gave the region access to Petersburg, from there the Atlantic Ocean, and so all of the trading that goes with that. So though North Carolina did afford certain freedoms that Virginia did not, you would not have found some of those in other states. But I just want to still take a moment to consider what life must have been like for someone like Thomas Day. Moving freely between communities was just inherently fraught with potential dangers. Anyone could accuse you of being a runaway slave, and there was very little you could have done to try to defend yourself. If you were, you could not legally represent or speak for yourself in court. You could be seized or jailed with little recourse, as again, black men could not take oaths in court at the time. So from the beginning, Day seemed to have a very clear recognition of the fact that this was the case, and to be taken seriously within a system that was inherently unfair to everyone who wasn't white, essentially, it was of the utmost importance that he really figure out how to deftly maneuver. There was an array of societal regulations that he had to contend with. But he also, at the same time, had to remain completely above reproach in order to just cement his reputation amongst a white community that was always vigilant. So in short, he knew that his success was directly tied to how he was perceived by the white community. By all accounts, Day seems to have cultivated a character that engendered respect and trust amongst the people of Milton. We even have some documentation that really tells us directly the community's attitude towards Day, which is kind of remarkable. Because in an 1826 law prohibited free people of color from migrating to North Carolina, Day was forced to petition the state to allow his wife to join him from Virginia. So as a result, Day petitioned the General Assembly, and along with the support of 61 prominent white men, they attested basically to his trustworthiness and his character. He was characterized by the state's Attorney General as a free man of color of very fair character, an excellent mechanic, industrious, honest, and sober in his habits. By 1850, his business was responsible for 1/6 of all the furniture made in the state of North Carolina. So in 1848, Day purchased the Union Tavern, which was on approximately a 70 by 200 foot lot, for roughly $1,050, which is about the equivalent of $40,000 today. According to census records, at the height of his worth, Day owned his home, a shop in town, a farm and land in the country, as well as dozens of enslaved people. Now, the idea of a person of color who themselves was an enslaver does seem hard for us to reconcile today, right? Historians have noted that this decision was likely either motivated by humanitarian or economic motives. So it's not completely clear to us what Thomas Day's motivations were, right? We can never fully know that. What we can say for certain is that the esteem of the white community was absolutely crucial for Day to maintain the success of his business and to also safeguard, the safety of his family. So one historian, Peter Wood of Duke University, reminded us that for black people who were engaged in business with white planters, the best cover, if you will, was to own enslaved people, or at least to call the black workers that you had as such. And so we know that Day employed black, mulatto, and white individuals in his workshop. So there was, he had a really diverse group of people in his employ. This dichotomy is kind of summed up in a little anecdote concerning the Milton Presbyterian Church, which you see the interior of here. Day agreed to make the pews for the church, but on the condition that he would be allowed to sit in the main sanctuary. So typically at the time, people of color would have been made to sit in the balcony or in the back rows of the church. And that seems to be the case. Day did create the pews, and he and his wife were entered in as full members of the congregation, and there was no notation of race placed next to their names. So according to one story, which is particularly discussed amongst Day's descendants, Day made the pews with the stipulation that his enslaved workers would also be allowed to join him in the lower seats. So knowing what we do about the society that Day was operating in, it seems unlikely he would have made such a public demand, which he knew would have been, would have put him under scrutiny. And he, really had to kind of stay above reproach, as we said. So many of Day's descendants, though, insist that, according to family lore, he purchased enslaved people in his employ as a means of, rescuing them, which is something that was done from time to time among free people of color to reunite families and things like that. Whether Day's private sentiments were different than his public actions with regards to, particularly these enslaved workers, it's really impossible for us to know for sure. But any of that would have been much too dangerous to put into writing. So there's no, diary or letter that survives that indicates his sentiments. But this very uncertainty, I think, points to the fact that there will always be more to the story, more that we don't know. And as to Day's sentiments, we have to speculate based on what documentation we do have that survives. We do have some evidence that points to Day's way of thinking when it comes to this idea of slavery. So in June of 1835, we know that Day traveled to Philadelphia to attend the 5th Annual Convention for Improvement of Free People of Color. This event featured many who would go on to become prominent abolitionists. So it's kind of a who's who of people in the movement at that time. We know that he was in attendance, actually, thanks to an advertisement for the boarding house that he stayed in, which listed his name and his place of residence. You'll see highlighted at the very bottom. So even traveling out of state would have been fraught with potential dangers for Day, let alone going to an event that was populated by all of these, major anti-slavery activists. So it would seem, logically, that to have taken all of these risks, he must have done so because he supported the cause and he felt strongly about it. So that does give us some indication of what his inner sentiments were. We also know that Thomas Day and his wife chose to send their 3 children to Wesleyan Academy in Massachusetts. This was a co-ed boarding school, and the principal, as well as many of the faculty, were labeled as, quote, flaming abolitionists. So even crossing state lines for education, again, was illegal for non-whites. So once again, it seems really unlikely that Day would have taken all of those risks if he didn't, understand and agree with the school's philosophy. So in a letter to his daughter, we know that Day expounded on the virtues of cultivating a good character. We know that whatever Day privately believed, it was of the utmost importance to him to maintain the respect and esteem of the landed white men who he really relied on for his business and for his way of life. So remaining in the good graces of his community members was vital, but it was just one aspect of what brought Day's success as a cabinet maker. He really seemed to have an innate understanding of how to meet the needs of his clients. So by and large, again, these were wealthy planters and politicians, people who wanted fashionable furnishings that were very much in keeping with current trends. So a lot of this meant emulating the styles that we see in Europe. But Day was not satisfied with just recreating examples of existing designs, which a lot of his contemporaries were doing. He really put his own signature touch into each of the designs that he created, so that they were both, in vogue, they were stylish, but they were also a little bit innovative. And it was really his ability, I think, to strike that balance that made him both financially prosperous and a remarkable artist whose work, even today, continues to be sought after. But it would take him years to kind of formulate this signature style, so it evolved over time. And that was, a product of the styles and trends of the time, but also, I think, his development as an artist. So at the start of his career, Day was seeking to make a name for himself and really establish his reputation as someone who could create pieces that were in style and reasonably priced. So at that time, this is about the 1820s in North Carolina, that meant furniture in the classical style. So of course that meant incorporating certain Greek and Roman motifs that we might recognize. But what set Day really apart here was his ability to mimic those types of high quality pieces from, say, New York or Philadelphia, but again, made locally and at a lower cost. This had the unfortunate side effect, though, for us, of making it pretty difficult to firmly identify the pieces from the earliest part of his career, since they were really very much in keeping with what a lot of other people were doing. So, what kind of pieces would Day have been making at this time? We don't exactly know. We can't identify that many of them. We have to speculate. But this is what a parlor might have looked like in North Carolina in the 1820s. So for well-to-do farmers, politicians, businessmen, their tastes, again, would largely have reflected what was popular in Europe. And for them, Europe basically meant England and France. So in terms of materials, that usually meant using local woods like poplar, but under mahogany veneers, which of course we see in the day piece that's here. Mahogany, as I'm sure you know, is highly prized for its physical qualities. Of course, it has that beautiful grain, that really rich color, it's durable, but it was also kind of a status symbol, right? Because mahogany had to be imported, so therefore it was expensive. So again, the style kind of followed these European trends in terms of the design work. So there were those, for those who were able, especially those in Europe, they would ideally visit these kind of archaeological places or architectural sites to get design inspiration directly from those ancient works of art. But of course, not everyone would have had the means to be able to do that. So how do we get from a Greek stela that we see on the left to the American chair on the right? Well, we look at books. That's the simple answer, right? Books depicted prints of archaeological sites. There were books that showcased furniture designs. And because Day was literate, thanks to his upbringing as a free person and his Quaker education, he had ready access to these kinds of sources. So we can be almost certain that Day used this particular book as a source. It was incredibly popular at the time, and we find direct references in Day's designs to the figures that you see in John Hall's The Cabinet Maker's Assistant. So images of furniture were often disseminated as well by things like this, which is a broadside. You can see a beautiful reproduction of this up in the galleries. It's much larger. You can see all the lovely details. And so this was an advertising company in New York, but it did boast a wide array of designs that were fairly straightforward, but incorporated little ornate touches. So things like scrolling S-curves and these graceful sort of sloping lines that we see like in the last chair that we looked at. So we can even see this kind of direct reference in the ad itself. If you'll note the little Greek key design around the bottom edge of that border. You see the motif, of course, the antecedent to that in the example at right, where we have that Greek plate. So Day and lots of other cabinet makers would have seen these kinds of images, and they would have used them as their source material for local patrons. So they would have been very interested in designs that were popular in New York, so it makes sense they would look at things like broadsides and books that came from those places. So how then did this translate to Day's own work? Well, we can't be sure, again, of the many pieces from the very first years of his career. We do have here at left the earliest objects that can be confidently attributed to Day, and that's a pair of dining tables that we see. So Day's dining tables were probably modeled after earlier versions from Anthony Carvel, a French cabinet maker in Philadelphia. And so if we compare them here, we see that he incorporates some of his own touches. So he simplifies certain areas, like the columnar support there in the middle is a little bit more rectilinear, a little bit simpler. But he also adds his own little details, like the stylized leaf motif that runs along the bottom of the base there. So again, it was common, particularly in the kind of rural and smaller urban areas like where Day was, for cabinet makers to put their own spin, their own kind of regional spin on these designs, even if they were based on a pretty established kind of revival style. So Day was starting to come into his own as a designer. He was still basing his work on popular models, but he was starting to find ways to really personalize them and make each piece his own. And because he was designing furniture that would constitute part of a larger space, he also had to think about things like proportion, right? How the work is going to look in a home, particularly homes in the region he was in, which were largely now these Greek-style revival houses. And so the result was we start to see larger furniture. You have bigger spaces, so you have to fill that space and think about, kind of the scale of what that's going to look like inside. So this piece, for instance, is nearly 7 feet long, and it's more than 5 feet high, so it's really quite large. So Day seems really keenly aware of how solid this piece of furniture is, right? That's a lot of wood there. And while it's largely rectilinear, you can see how he tries to soften that a little bit by incorporating those lovely S-curves at the top corners, and using these beveled edges, which I think you can see a little bit throughout. So that exaggerated S-scroll at the top also allows for a little bit of that negative space to come through. So that gives it a little bit of a lightness that I think balances out the overall heaviness of the bottom of the piece. And also would help to accentuate any kind of silver or porcelain pieces that you might have displayed up at the top there. So pretty true design. Day produced a number of side chairs as well for his various clients. Each of those designs varies a little bit, which would allow each customer to feel that they had kind of a one-of-a-kind piece, and also allowed him a little bit of freedom to start experimenting with new forms and techniques. So he was not just producing the same pieces over and over again, he really was trying to individualize them. So each of these featured sloping, curved legs, again, it's typical of that Grecian style. Not quite as exaggerated or elaborate in the ornament as some examples that we see like Benjamin Latrobe's in the White House. But the example at left here was produced for then Governor David S. Reed, which was part of a quite substantial order and really a signifier of the level of prominence to which Day had risen at this point in his career. All right, so this example here, we see how Day starts to play with the ogee arch. The top rail, if you can see, there's a little point at the very center. It has this little subtle point, and it's flanked by that undulating sort of curve shape. The ogee arch can really originally be traced back to parts of the Middle East, and they were transmitted to the West by way of Venice. You see these windows all over Venice, sometimes called the Venetian arch in Western parlance. So the analogous kind of vertical version of that shape is called the cyma curve. And that derives from the Greek word for wave. And of course you can tell that sort of undulating shape that seems logical. We see variations on this particular shape and that curve repeated endlessly in furniture of the era. And of course Thomas Day's is no exception to that. And now we come to this piece, which may look familiar to some of you. It is in the collection of my museum, of course, the Columbia Museum of Art, and of course it is currently on display here. If you haven't had a chance to go see it, I do hope that you'll take some time, sometime after this, to get up close and personal and see some of these details. This piece is part of a pair, actually. The other piece is now in the collection of the North Carolina Museum of History, and they were both produced as part of that large order for Governor Reed. So a really substantial collection there that was made for the governor's mansion. It is a beautiful example of Day's prowess as a craftsman. He definitely creates pieces that were both elegant and well-made. And I just love the graceful curves on either side of the mirror. They seem to almost float there, right? They're just above that little marble top there. The mirror seems like almost suspended. Because we have a little more access to this piece, we were able to take some time to examine some of the details that we might otherwise not be able to see. So first, I just want to note the grain of the wood. So if you look at the drawers up at the top left there, you can see how Day thoughtfully chose similar and almost symmetrical pieces for the drawers that would underline this whole sense of harmony and balance. Almost all of Day's pieces are exactly symmetrical, or their shape, at least in their shape, they're exactly symmetrical. So I think he was thinking about that, even down to the grain of the wood. We also see the small little flourishes, like the little curved shape along the foot you see at the top right. And when examining that piece's joinery, we were able to open some of the drawers and see some of the mechanics behind them. We can see that dovetail joint, which was very typical of the era, and it's on display here in the construction of that particular joint there. This view also allows us to see that yellow pine that was behind the mahogany veneers, which of course you wouldn't see unless you opened the drawers. But poplar was used for drawer bottoms very often. It was a good wood that was commonly used there. Okay. So the more ornamental elements also give us a little bit of insight, I think, into Day's process. So both of the S curves that flank the mirror and the decorative element at the very top there can be traced to images in the Hall book that we saw earlier. So it seems like Day was freely incorporating and combining these various types of elements to create, again, completely original new pieces. So the S curve seems to be modeled after the bottom center sketch in the page that you see up there next to it. But at the very top, he has incorporated a hand-carved kind of a lotus design. So if you see the very top of that, it almost has these curved and pointed petal-like shapes. So again, the idea may have derived from other sketches in the same book, but he's incorporating them in new ways. Likewise, he also seems to have used Hall as a starting point for the top of the mirror. But again, Day puts his own spin on the final design. It doesn't look exactly like any of those, but you can see where he's starting to get some of his inspiration. In the 90s, there was some scholarship, interestingly, that suggested that some elements of Day's work might be read as links to West African designs, or perhaps even a suggestion of a kind of quintessential African-American style. So the mirrored S curves that we see at the top there, for instance, some have made the link from those shapes to the Sankofa symbol, which represents a bird that's pointed forward but is looking backwards. And it's true that Day did employ a variety of different kinds of artisans in his workshops from different backgrounds. Some were listed as African American, though of unknown origin. So he did incorporate techniques that he found from various places and that were maybe brought from some of his employees from further afield. So whether they were from Virginia or Moravia, probably by way of Winston-Salem or maybe even farther. In addition to being responsible for a substantial production of furniture, as we know, Day was one of the few furniture makers who also designed architectural interiors. So here we have a lovely example that incorporates the ogee arches that we saw earlier, but again in their original architectural form rather than in the details of furnishings. So in addition to parlors and staircases and mantels, the porch of the Garland Buford house here is also attributed to Thomas Day. The design features Day's trademark incorporation of these cutouts. Again, you'll see that use of negative space throughout. And he uses a combination of geometric and organic shapes. So you're seeing both the kind of straightforward rectilinear forms as well as these more sinuous shapes. And again, I think that combination really helps to give it a sense of balance and lightness. So it seems like Day really reveled in these opportunities, I think, to work on a larger scale. His impact could be felt not only in the furniture, right, but in the actual space of the houses themselves. But the fact that his business ultimately shuttered does not make it a failed effort. He had many decades of success. Day is responsible for, in all likelihood, well over 200 pieces, but 200 to be sure. He made a name for himself as a man of color in a society dominated by white men. And perhaps most importantly, I think developed an incredible body of work and a distinct artistic style. So many decades after Day's death, his work is still the subject of scholarship and exhibitions. His furniture is prized both in family homes and museum collections. And as recently as February of this year, Day's workshop was actually designated as North Carolina's newest state historic site. So it's the first one to be added in decades. So once the site is fully developed, the museum will encompass the workshop, the showroom, and the personal residence of Thomas Day, all furnished as they would have been during his lifetime. So if you do find yourself in North Carolina, or Virginia, because it's really close, I hope you'll consider making a stop there. Of course, I hope you'll also take a look again at the piece that we have on view here. I think it's up until about mid-August, August 11th, I think I want to say. So please do take a look, get up close and personal and try to see some of those lovely details that he incorporated. And there's so much more about Thomas Day that was left unsaid. There's so much more that we don't know. But I think the renewed interest in Day's life and his work suggests that the research will continue and that we'll discover even more about this remarkable figure, hopefully. His work and his art have already far outlived his 6 decades of life, and I think we're all richer for having been able to experience it.